Speaker, I stand before you in this Honourable House this afternoon to lend my support to the bill currently being debated, which is shortly entitled the Appropriation 2021 Bill 2020. Indeed, Mr. Speaker, this budget debate comes at a time when the world is facing chaos because of the COVID-19 pandemic. Mr. Speaker, these are unprecedented times, and of course, this particular budget calls for a different response. As such, Mr. Speaker, I want to commend the mover of the bill, the member for number 7, who has responsibility for the Ministry of Finance, for laying before this Honourable House a budget, Mr. Speaker, that ensures that the people of St. Kitts and Nevis continue along that path of growth. Mr. Speaker, I don't think that anyone could reasonably expect that in light of the economic challenges brought on by COVID-19, that the budget in respect of 2021 will be the same as other budgets in the past. However, Mr. Speaker, you would recognize that in some respects, the budget remains similar to all of the other budgets passed under this Team Unity administration. Since taking office, Mr. Speaker, each year, Team Unity has presented a budget that is tax-free, Mr. Speaker. And in light of the fact that government revenues are being challenged by the effects of COVID-19, we are still able to present a tax-free budget this year. There are several different organizations, Mr. Speaker, which have posited that one measure in terms of dealing with the financial effects of COVID-19 is actually to increase taxes on certain classes of the populace. Team Unity, Mr. Speaker, has not taken that particular route. However, in light of the fact that we have presented a budget that looks towards the future, Mr. Speaker, you would have heard much criticisms coming this morning from the leader of the opposition. His presentation certainly was no surprise to me, Mr. Speaker, because it reflects what I have been hearing from him since becoming the leader of the opposition. Nothing but doom and gloom, Mr. Speaker. When he was Prime Minister, all things were good in the Federation of St. Kitts and Nevis, contrary to what the facts would point to. However, since then, Mr. Speaker, everything on the Team Unity is up for criticism. And I suppose, Mr. Speaker, that in politics you do get some of that. But I do believe, Mr. Speaker, that that must also be tempered with the reality of things. We ought to be honest with the citizens of the Federation of St. Kitts and Nevis, Mr. Speaker, and let them know what the facts are. Mr. Speaker, in doing research for this budget presentation, I would have read many different articles. And as I went through all of those articles, Mr. Speaker, they painted a dim picture as to what is currently happening and what one can possibly expect throughout 2021. Some of these reports, Mr. Speaker, the International Monetary Fund, the World Economic Outlook, and Mr. Speaker, interestingly, it's entitled A Long and Difficult Ascent. And I want to refer to some of these reports, Mr. Speaker, because I do believe that they will put things into perspective. The financial realities and other realities at which we are currently looking at and amidst which this budget is being presented. Mr. Speaker, if you turn to the very same report, and I reference page 13 of the report, and it says, more than 1 million lives have been lost to COVID-19 since the start of the year, and the toll continues to rise. Many more have suffered serious illness. Close to 90 million people are expected to fall into extreme deprivation this year. Close to 90 million people are expected to fall into extreme deprivation this year. It goes on to say, Mr. Speaker, moreover, recovery is not assured while the pandemic continues to spread. With renewed upticks in COVID-19 infections in places that had reduced local transmission to low levels, reopenings have paused and targeted shutdowns are being reinstated. Economies everywhere face difficult paths back to pre-pandemic activity levels. It says, while the global economy is coming back, the ascent will likely be long, uneven, and uncertain. Indeed, compared to our forecast in June, prospects have worsened significantly in some emerging markets and developing economies where infections are rising rapidly. Consequently, emerging markets and developing economies, excluding China, are projected to incur a greater loss of output over 2020 to 2021 relative to the pre-pandemic projected path when compared to advanced economies. And Mr. Speaker, as you go throughout the report, you see similar views being expressed. Page 15, global growth is projected at negative 4.4% in 2020, a less severe contraction than forecast in the June 20th World Economic Outlook. And it says further down, global growth is projected at 5.2% in 2021, a little lower than the June 2020 World Economic Outlook report. That's only one such report, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the World Bank Group flagship report, June 2020. And again, with your permission, I reference this particular report. It says, Mr. Speaker, the COVID-19 pandemic has spread with astounding speed to every part of the world and infected millions. The health and human toll is already large and continues to grow, with hundreds of thousands of deaths and many more suffering from diminished prospects and disrupted livelihoods. The pandemic represents the largest economic shock the world economy has witnessed in decades. Decades, Mr. Speaker. And it goes on to say, causing a collapse in global activity. Various mitigation measures such as lockdowns, closure of schools, and non-essential business and travel restrictions have been imposed by most countries to limit the spread of COVID-19 and ease the strain on healthcare systems. The pandemic and associated mitigation measures have sharply curbed consumption and investment, as well as restricted labor supply and production. The cross-border spillovers have disrupted financial and commodity markets, global trade, supply chains, travel, and tourism. In all, the pandemic is expected to plunge a majority of countries into recession this year, with per capita output contracting in the largest fraction of countries since 1870. Since 1870, Mr. Speaker. That's more than 100 years ago, Mr. Speaker. And I repeat, in all, the pandemic is expected to plunge a majority of countries into recession this year, with per capita output contracting in the largest fraction of countries since 1870. Advanced economies are projected to shrink by 7% in 2020. Mr. Speaker, these are two global reports. But it's not just global reports I have read, Mr. Speaker, because there are other reports which reference Latin America and the Caribbean. Some of those reports, Mr. Speaker, reference the Caribbean itself. Some reference the OECS, and there are others which are localized to St. Kitts and Nevis. There's one such report here, Mr. Speaker, Global American, and it's dated July 2nd, 2020. And it says the COVID-19 pandemic has been a major unexpected economic blow for the Caribbean. In 2019, most of the region had enjoyed continued economic expansion, and forecasts for 2020 were promising. COVID-19, which arrived in the Caribbean in March, changed that. With the interruption of tourism and severe global downturn, many Caribbean nations have been forced to scramble to keep their economies afloat, and a number are finding themselves squeezed in terms of their ability to repay their international debt obligations. No doubt, 2020 will go down as the worst years in memory for the Caribbean. The worst years in memory for the Caribbean. The IMF is forecasting a 10.3% contraction for tourist-dependent economies before a recovery in 2021 of 4.8% growth. This has important implications for what the Caribbean is going to look like at the other end of the COVID-19 pandemic. And it says the Caribbean holds one of the most open set of economies in the world. Most countries are small, import many of their necessities, and depend on foreign demand to pay their way in the world. While the export of gold, oil, natural gas, bauxite, and nickel play an important role in a handful of economies, Cuba, Jamaica, Trinidad and Tobago, Guyana, and Suriname, the region is highly dependent on tourism. According to the International Monetary Fund, tourism accounts for 50 to 90% of GDP and employment in most Caribbean countries and territories. I intend to come back to this report, Mr. Speaker, because it also says something that I consider to be quite important. We turn to the OECS, Mr. Speaker, and we have a report here, COVID-19 and Beyond, Impact Assessment and Responses, and it's produced, as I said, by the OECS. And the report, Mr. Speaker, references several different impacts on different sectors of the economy within the OECS sub-region. For example, Mr. Speaker, sectoral economic impact, and it looks at the impact on travel tourism, which I would have just referenced. And importantly, Mr. Speaker, it notes that in terms of St. Kitts and Nevis, as a percentage share of total employment, 2018, St. Kitts and Nevis stood just at about 60%, actually higher than any other island within the OECS sub-region. In terms of GDP, contribution to GDP, the only other country which had a higher contribution to GDP is that of the British Virgin Islands. And Mr. Speaker, I can go on to several other areas of this report because it speaks to the impact on the agriculture and food security sector. It speaks to the impact on the social protection sector and what is expected to happen in terms of persons who have been living in poverty, and amidst COVID-19, that poverty rates are expected to increase within the OECS sub-region. St. Kitts, of course, Mr. Speaker, is referenced and is no different to the other countries within the sub-region. As a matter of fact, Mr. Speaker, it notes here that in terms of St. Kitts and Nevis, that the beneficiaries pre-COVID-19, and it speaks to the Public Assistance Program, the PAP, and the Child Disability Grant, you had 3,656 persons who were beneficiaries. It says that the projected severe poverty due to COVID-19 for St. Kitts and Nevis has increased that number to approximately 9,000 persons, and so the coverage becomes 43%. Mr. Speaker, you would have heard earlier that in terms of social assistance, that this budget does nothing in terms of social assistance to persons. But here is a report from the OECS, Mr. Speaker, indicating that approximately 9,000 persons, Mr. Speaker, are benefiting from the poverty alleviation program. And the fact is, Mr. Speaker, that a majority of those persons, an additional almost 6,000 persons, Mr. Speaker, became beneficiaries of the program due to COVID-19. Mr. Speaker, it is public knowledge that when a number of persons lost their jobs and the government introduced a stimulus package, that stimulus package took into account persons who normally would not have qualified for the PAP. But because of circumstances, those persons have been allowed to apply, and for the most part, those persons still remain on the PAP program. The Minister of Finance, in his remarks, would have noted that I think it is some additional $2 million which have been made available for the PAP program in respect of the year 2021. And he was correct, Mr. Speaker, when he pointed out that relative to PAP, it is not the only social assistance program being provided by the government. As you look across several different ministries, one would recognize that there are several other programs. You look within the Ministry of Education, for example, you have the SAFE program, which provides assistance to persons attending CFBC, AVEC, and other tertiary institutions. Within the same Ministry of Education, Mr. Speaker, you also have the SELF program. And I've been told that there's actually an increase of $5 million in respect of the PAP program. And that is a significant increase, Mr. Speaker, by any measure. Last year, 24 million. This year, $29 million, Mr. Speaker. And so if you do the math, Mr. Speaker, the increase is what? About 15 to 20%? Somewhere about there, Mr. Speaker. And that is money being allocated by the government for persons who have found themselves in difficult positions at this point in time. You have the SELF program, as I was saying, Mr. Speaker, which provides assistance to students registering for overseas exams. And I'm certain, Mr. Speaker, that as the numbers come in, you're probably going to see an increase in the number of students who are given support this year. But that program just doesn't cover, Mr. Speaker, examination fees. It also covers assisting students with textbooks. And the Minister of Education is here. And I don't know if he has the figures in terms of what would have been spent thus far for this year. But again, Mr. Speaker, one would expect to see an increase there. When we closed down the schools last year, Mr. Speaker, this year, we still ensured that in terms of that safety net of providing schools meals to the children, it was provided. That is an expense, Mr. Speaker, that the government could have opted to avoid. However, when we sat down, we said no, that more and more parents are out of work, and it's at this difficult time that more and more of those parents will expect to receive assistance from the government, and as such, we put things in place to ensure that those students who are still in need of a lunch were able to go to the schools and receive that lunch. Mr. Speaker, that is why when Team Unity campaigned this year, we were able to speak about building a stronger and safer future. That is part of building the stronger and safer future, Mr. Speaker. Putting things in place to ensure that in terms of the social safety net, it still continues to protect our people, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I go back to the report from the OECS, and if you look at the same report, Mr. Speaker, it says a severe poverty rate, and again, St. Kitts and Nevis reference. In 2007, in St. Kitts and Nevis, the severe poverty rate was estimated, Mr. Speaker, to be 1.5%. 1.5%, Mr. Speaker. Children were projected to be at 30.7%. All pre-pandemic, Mr. Speaker, 0.8%. All projected after the pandemic, Mr. Speaker, 17.0%. And so the overall poverty rate, Mr. Speaker, in St. Kitts and Nevis is expected to increase to 37.7%. So, Mr. Speaker, we have basically gone from an amount of 17% to an amount, my apologies, Mr. Speaker, to an amount of 21% overall for St. Kitts and Nevis, an increase of 4%. And the government has responded, Mr. Speaker, responded in a timely manner, because this is a government, Mr. Speaker, that has taken leadership, Mr. Speaker. We didn't wait, Mr. Speaker, to respond to the effects of COVID-19. That's the report from the OECS, Mr. Speaker. We go locally, Mr. Speaker, Economic and Financial Review, the Eastern Caribbean Central Bank, and the number of things which are important to note based on this report, Mr. Speaker. It says in the report, Mr. Speaker, and the first thing that I want to reference in the report, it says, with the exception of St. Kitts and Nevis and Anguilla, all member governments recorded low outlays in interest payments as they benefited from loan repayment moratoriums from selected creditors. With the exception of St. Kitts and Nevis and Anguilla, all member governments recorded low outlays in interest payments as they benefited from loan repayment moratoriums from selected creditors. Mr. Speaker, I wanted to bear that in mind, because before I go further into it, the report speaks specifically to St. Kitts and Nevis. And it says economic data available at the time of writing point to an unparalleled contraction, Mr. Speaker, unparalleled contraction in economic activity in St. Christopher and Nevis in the first half of 2020 due to the COVID-19 pandemic. It says the development economic activity in St. Kitts and Nevis is estimated to have declined in the first 2 quarters of 2020 relative to activity in the comparable period of the previous year. This development was as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, which necessitated the implementation of containment measures globally and in the Federation. Mr. Speaker, it says it is estimated that construction activity, which accounts for over 15% to the Federation's economic activity on average, is estimated to have decelerated as both public and private sector projects were temporarily stalled due to lockdown and curfew. I want to pause here, Mr. Speaker, before I refer to the next report and speak to a few things, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, all of the reports have noted the fact that you have a recession within the world. A recession that you have not seen in decades. It means that in terms of growth, Mr. Speaker, there is negative growth. St. Kitts and Nevis, no different. And so we have seen that negative growth, Mr. Speaker, for this year. But in spite of what we have seen for this year, Mr. Speaker, I think in several different respects, St. Kitts and Nevis must be given credit under this Team Unity administration for doing a very good job. I go back to page 9 of the ECCU report, Mr. Speaker, the Central Bank report. The fact that all of the other countries, Mr. Speaker, is saw a decrease recorded in lower outlays and interest payments. It means, Mr. Speaker, that while other countries have been going to their creditors and saying, I can't afford to continue to pay my debt, I'm asking you to decrease the interest payments, decrease the principal payments. The Federation of St. Kitts and Nevis, Mr. Speaker, has not done that. We have continued to pay our bills as expected. And that is because of prudent financial management, Mr. Speaker. We are not broke, as some persons would have you believe. We haven't run up the largest public debt in this world, as was done by the leader of the opposition. That is why we still can afford to continue to pay. We haven't run to anyone, Mr. Speaker, and asked to receive a loan to date. We have said yes, that next year we expect to have some loan financing. But it's not loan financing alone we said we expect to have next year. We have also said that approximately $30 million, Mr. Speaker, will be used from savings. I heard the argument, Mr. Speaker, that only people who don't have any money borrow money from a bank. Total rubbish, Mr. Speaker. Absolute rubbish. If the banks are offering a good interest rate, you save your money, you get some interest on your money, and you borrow some money from the bank. People do that all the time, Mr. Speaker. That is nothing new. Prudent financial management. You get sick tomorrow, for example, Mr. Speaker. All right, take all your money. Invest it in the house that costs $1 million. And then you get sick tomorrow. You have no money to pay for health care and you can't enjoy the house. That makes sense, Mr. Speaker? That is what the member for number 6 is saying to the people of St. Kitts and Nevis. Don't save any money for a rainy day. That is expected from him, Mr. Speaker, because that is how we run this country. Bankrupt the country. I'm coming to all of that. Bankrupt the country, Mr. Speaker. And now we want to come in here to give this government advice as to how to spend money. Imagine, Mr. Speaker, you go out there and you meet a crazy man out there on the street. And that crazy man out there on the street telling you how you must think and how you must operate. You're going to take his advice, Mr. Speaker? Well, if you do, you're just as crazy as him. Probably even more crazy than him. You're crazier than him. Can't take advice from a man who is crazy, Mr. Speaker. And so you have a man who bankrupt the country, who has now come into the parliament to tell you how to spend the country money. He had it to spend, and what he did with it, he wasted it. He said, poof, the money gone. Money gone, green fence down the valley. Up until now, he now account for how the money has been spent. And he comes in here asking for an account as to how monies have been spent. The same gentleman is in charge of the Public Accounts Committee. And so he can convene a meeting any day of the Public Accounts Committee to ask how monies have been spent. He can summon before the Public Accounts Committee the Accountant General, the Financial Secretary, and whoever else he deems necessary the director of audit, to give an account as to how monies have been spent. And so when you hear him come in here and he jump up and he said, I am not asking these questions because I want to criticize it. You have to seriously wonder about it. Insincere. You have the tools. That isn't the only tool available to you. The order paper provides for questions to be asked. And so he can come in here and he can question any member of the government side. And answers are to be provided to him. But he has never exercised that. Not once. Then he comes in and he criticizes Mr. Speaker. So, Mr. Speaker, the point is, we haven't had to ask a single soul for any credit. We have not gone to any credit to Mr. Speaker. And so we can't afford to pay you the interest. We haven't done that. And persons must take that into consideration, because questions are being asked as to how have we spent the money. He said he left $900 million in the treasury, Mr. Speaker. But what he hasn't said is how much debt he has left. Because he left more than $900 million worth of debt. We paid the IMF $117 million worth of debt that he left. Tell him to subtract that from the $900 million. And if we start subtracting the amount of debt that he left, there would be the $900 million that he's referring to. And so if he's going to give one side of the story, Mr. Speaker, he should give the other side. Make it balanced. Give a true account to the people as to your stewardship as Prime Minister and Minister of Finance. Mr. Speaker, but amidst all which have been said, what is the IMF saying relative to the growth prospects for St. Kitts and Nevis for 2021? I have an article here, Mr. Speaker, and the article says, IMF forecasts St. Kitts and Nevis to be the second fastest growing country in the Caribbean, and it's dated October 26, 2020. The article says from 2021 to 2025, St. Kitts and Nevis will grow at the fastest and highest rate in the entire Caribbean region after the current pandemic-driven recession. According to the International Monetary Fund, St. Kitts and Guyana are forecast to be the top economies in terms of growth in 2021. The projected growth expectation for the years 2021 and 2025 for some CARICOM countries are Guyana, 8.1%, Barbados, 7.4% and 1.8%, Belize, 8% and 2%, Jamaica, 3.6% and 2.1%, St. Kitts and Nevis, 8% and 2.7%, and St. Lucia, 7.2% and 1.8%. Mr. Speaker, in reading an article earlier, it referenced some countries having gold, some having bauxite, some having oil, and all sorts of other natural resources. The very same Guyana, Mr. Speaker, which is projected to grow at 8%, the same 8% that St. Kitts is expected to grow at, Mr. Speaker, recently discovered oil. And that is the primary reason as to why Guyana is expected to grow at 8%. We don't have no natural resource here, Mr. Speaker. We use our God-given talents to develop this economy. That is what we have been doing. And as a result of that, coming out of this pandemic in 2021, St. Kitts and Nevis is expected to grow by 8%. So when you hear questions about unincorporated business tax, and why is it that you expect the tax to reflect a moderate increase? Well, if you have growth of 8%, Mr. Speaker, then what do you expect? You would expect the government will collect more in terms of revenue. That's common sense, Mr. Speaker.
And we have a record number of businesses.
And you have had more businesses which have registered. So that must also be taken into consideration. Yes, some businesses have closed, but some of those businesses will come back on stream in 2021. Additionally, we have had more businesses being registering. Week after week, I go to cabinet, and you get the cabinet submissions in terms of businesses that are proposing to open. Small businesses. I am not talking about the large businesses, Mr. Speaker. Small businesses opening up because some expanding. In this climate, persons are becoming innovative. Persons have seen opportunities that perhaps they never saw before. Because I was into one business and that business sector has seen a decline, it doesn't mean that our creative young persons have sat down and have accepted that there's nothing else that they can do. Instead, they have looked at other opportunities and taken advantage of those opportunities. Within the last few weeks, I have had a number of young persons who have approached me, asking me how to go about getting a business license, how to go about going to the Ministry of Trade to seek concessions. I have had conversations with the Minister of Trade. In those conversations, she has said that yes, they are taking a careful look to see how these businesses can thrive and survive within current circumstances. The banks out there lending monies to persons. The banks actually calling people, telling them come borrow, because the banks remain liquid. And so they're taking a chance on persons. So when we say unincorporated business tax, we'll see some increase, some sort of rebound, Mr. Speaker. It is because of that careful analysis, looking at the entire sector and making the determination as to what will happen. Even as he spoke about it, Mr. Speaker, he appears to be a confused man. Because on one hand, he says things are bad. How do you expect that you're going to collect more money? On the other hand, he says spend more on capital projects. So on one hand, you ain't collecting any money, and you will not be collecting any money. But on the next hand, he says spend more. Then he said, why you need to borrow money? I mean, really?
He's confused.
He's confused. What is it he really wants? And that is why I'm strongly of the view that someone wrote the script that he rendered in here this morning. The man from Antigua, Dr. Isaac?
Yes.
I believe so too. Because as I enter in this morning, I saw a red car out there. He jumped out the red car, the same man jumped out the red car. And as he jumped out and the man jumped out, I saw the man put something in his hand. That's why Antigua in trouble? I don't get cussed by Antigua before you come make I want to get cussed again. Confused. It's as if, well, this is what you want to say, but somebody else whispering the next ear. Say that. So your conscience telling you say one thing, and it's like, journal is telling you say next thing. So I say what journal telling me.
But you should ask Jeffrey.
Maybe Jeffrey would have done a better job too. Maybe Jeffrey would have done a better job. Remember, for number one would have done a better job. Look at him over there. Taking copious notes, doing his research, to have a fit and proper presentation. That's like a man who come in here with some speech that somebody put in his hand, and at the end of the day, not even he himself is understanding what it is he's saying.
He said that over suddenly
I wasn't at the convention, I don't know what he said. Remember, for number one, that's correct. He said, plead the fifth. And say, Mr. Speaker, we're doing well.
Yeah.
We needed to receive 22.4 million in emergency support from IMF. Dated the 6th of May. We ain't going to the IMF to ask for any money. Everybody else going. Next article here. Caribbean Region Quarterly Bulletin. The pandemic saga continues. And as you read through the article, Mr. Speaker, it says in here, debt to GDP ratios have increased from an average of 70.3% of GDP in 2019 to a projected 79.1% of GDP in 2020. In response to the COVID-19 pandemic, the OECS countries have procured funding from multiple multilateral organizations. The Caribbean Development Bank, CDB, has provided financing of EC 63.8 million and have approved several projects, grants for personal protective equipment purchase, US 3 million. Social sector support, SMEs and agriculture, US 25 million. Debt service liquidity support, 94 million US. Policy-based loan support, US 140 million. And repurposing of undisturbed balances, US 30 million. The IMF has recently approved rapid credit instruments of EC 291.4 million. And the World Bank has provided a fast-track policy development loan of 212.3 million. Additionally, the United Nations launched a joint initiative on MESICS of a COVID-19 multi-sectoral response plan and US 29.7 million funding appeal. We ain't borrowing no money from nobody, Mr. Speaker. Not a soul. We have increased spending in the health sector, and this report references that, but no money from nobody. CDB lends US 20 million to Dominica to counter the COVID-19 fallout. Barbados has had to go and seek money. Jamaica has gone to look money. I think I spoke to St. Lucia. Has gone to look money, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I don't know if you saw recently, it was circulating via WhatsApp and within the news. Pensioners in Antigua protesting, can't get paid. Months now they can't get paid. Not one single pensioner in St. Kitts and Nevis can say that he or she hasn't received their money. My father is a pensioner, and I know if he hadn't received his, I would have heard from him. You also, Minister Phipps. Parents are pensioners also, and they don't go sleep worried as to where they're going to get money come the end of the month. They get paid every month.
He gets hits every month.
Douglas is a pensioner too?
Right, and over 62.
Social security or government pension?
He gets social.
He gets social?
Yeah, the governmental lot of money.
Oh, yeah, I remember you had the governmental lot of money. Travel up and down the world. But you all heard him this morning say he went to Paris. He spoke to somebody in Paris about taking a haircut.
Yes.
He went to England, he spoke to somebody else about taking a haircut. He come like he went all over the world to talk about haircut. By now, he must be in all the different hairstyles in the world. He's a good barber, yes. A very good barber, but I'm going to get to that part of it too. A very, very good barber. And so he came in, and maybe that's why he was speaking about Social Security. Maybe he thinks that next month, he will get his pension from Social Security. But the important point, Mr. Speaker, is as he spoke about Social Security, is that this government has used Social Security funds that persons have saved to do things which it ought not to be used to do. He went so far, Mr. Speaker, as to say that persons must be worried about their money because they're saving it for in times of need. Mr. Speaker, I was surprised that the member for number 6 would speak about persons saving monies in times of need, especially at this particular point in time. Let us go back to the haircut, Mr. Speaker. It is the member for number 6 who gave Brimstone Hill a haircut. I'm not even sure if at this point in time Brimstone Hill is operating. Brimstone Hill saved money with the government, expecting that when there is a rainy day, Brimstone Hill would have that money to use. And what he did with it? He squandered it and then told Brimstone Hill to take a haircut. The Methodist Church saved money with his government, and he gave the Methodist Church a haircut. Imagine you go to church every week. The pastor tell you put in your tithes, and as the pastor around the cup, you try your money. Try your money. And then what happened to your money? 50%. Don't just puff it away. 50% haircut. A man knows certain days just this week I was told there was a funeral being held, I think, at the Anglican Church, which was supposed to be held at the Methodist Church. Is your word talking about it? Yes. You know about the funeral?
Which one?
Where he was? He was down here thing. And they said, you correct me if I'm wrong, you know, because I don't want to be telling any lies. But somebody was speaking about it. No, I didn't go to the funeral. But they said the church was under repair. And so they had to use a different church. Anybody know if the Methodist Church was under repair? Is Jeffrey a good Methodist? No, you have your own church now. I just remember it.
Is the Methodist Church in Nevis?
The Methodist Church in Nevis.
Yes.
Thank you.
I remember was coming.
Thank you. The Methodist Church in Nevis. And they had to use the Anglican Church. And as they were keeping the funeral, they said the minister asked to be excused for a minute. And she went down and she whispered something to somebody from the Anglican Church. And then she said she got permission to collect an offering so that the church can repair its roof. Now the point is, Mr. Speaker, that the church needs its money now in order to repair the roof. The Methodist Church, it's more than a rainy day. Because if you sit down in the church, you're going to get wet. And so now that the church is in need of its money, the church doesn't have access to the money. Why the church doesn't have access to the money? The member for number 6 bankrupt the country and gave the church a haircut. I don't know if I could make it any clearer than that. And come in here and talk about persons from Social Security and putting money at risk. He knows about risk. Because now when persons are in need of their money, they don't have access to it. Because he wasted the people's money. He squandered the people's money. He likes to blame it on the financial meltdown, the recession that you had back in 2008. But let us look at the comparisons, Mr. Speaker. You have a recession now, far deeper than that. And this government hasn't given anyone a haircut. Far deeper, far wider. You haven't had the world come to a standstill back then, as it has now. People locked down in their houses. No plane landing. No cruise ships coming. All the hotels closed down. Many businesses closed around the world. Far deeper. And we haven't resorted to the same measures. And we do not intend to, Mr. Speaker, because we have managed the people's money prudently. That is what good government is all about, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, hear that song and dance about the peace initiative. And as I heard him speak about the peace initiative, he said his grandmother used to say, you can't squeeze water out of stone. When my grandmother used to say, you are the guy to talk about that? Douglas got the guy to come in here come talk about crime and peace initiative, Mr. Speaker. He can't be serious. And, excuse me, Mr. Speaker, the member for number 6. There's a guy to come in here to speak about crime and peace initiative. He hasn't said to us how we got there in terms of the gang violence and the crime in this country. He hasn't said to us, Mr. Speaker, that under him we were dubbed as the country in the world with the highest murder rate. We were dubbed as the murder capital. The murder capital of the entire world. That is the distinction that we received under him. Murder capital of the world. The man has no shame. The article here saying Kitts and Nevis among 10 nations with highest murder rate in the world. Small St. Kitts and Nevis, the smallest twin island nation in the entire world. And you're ranked as having, you're among the 10 nations with the highest murder rate in the world. Mr. Speaker, I came across an article, and the article is headed, Government's Lack of Crime Plan, No Comfort to Parents, says St. Kitts Nevis Opposition. And it says, it's dated the 8th of June 2017. The leader of the opposition in St. Kitts and Nevis has pounced on the Team Unity government. Pounced, they used to call him Cat, I think, at one point in time, Huh? Take up your bat when you lose? Pounced. They couldn't use a better word. Pounced like a cat. The leader of the opposition in St. Kitts and Nevis has pounced on the Team Unity government, accusing them of having no plan to deal with increasing crime levels in the country. Denzel Douglas also lambasted Prime Minister Timothy Harris for being incapable of offering comfort to the friends and family of missing teenager Leanna Napoleon. Today marks 1 month since she went missing on 8 May, and Douglas has already called out the government on their deafening silence on the matter. The former Prime Minister in power between 1995 and 2015 spoke out after a week of shocking crimes in the Federation. Douglas has slammed the government for criticizing and tearing down and deliberately deceiving the people while in opposition, but offering no alternative to put in place since winning the election. It says, and I quote him, "This is why we have the chaos and confusion and the mayhem and the slaughtering in our country, because there were a group of persons who tore down everything that they saw within the scope of politics in order to get into government. And now they are in government, they are unable to manage the situation because there's no plan and no strategy," he said during his weekly radio show. And he said the PM is clueless. Next article here. Some web news, opposition leader Denzel Douglas calls for a new plan and strategy to combat escalating crime. Mr. Speaker, as I said, the man has no gall. Because, Mr. Speaker, the reality is that under Denzel Douglas, crime skyrocketed out of control. In 2000, Mr. Speaker, 5 years after he got into government, we had 3 murders. 2001, 6. 2002, 5. 2003, 100% increase. Went to 10. 2004, 11. 2005, 18. No, 2005, 8. 2006, 17. More than 100% increase between 2005 and 2006. 2007, decreased by 1 to 16. 2008, 23. 2009, 27. 2010, 21. 2011, 35. 2012, 18. 2013, 21. 2014, 24. And 2015, 30. How many murders we have had thus far for you? 9? 9. Let me see. So between this 15-year period, Mr. Speaker, only in 2000 and 2002, 2000, 2001 and 2002, 2005. So only in those 4 years, Mr. Speaker, you had less than 9. Only in those 4 years, you had less than 9. You had an all-time high of 35 in 2011. Almost 4 times the amount that we have had thus far for 2020. And he comes in and he criticizes the peace initiative. He wants to know how the money is being spent. What he needs to do, Mr. Speaker, is to go out on the street and ask persons how they feel about crime in this country now as compared to when he was in government. Tell him to go over the strip on a Friday night and ask the persons over there how they felt about coming out in the evening. Tell him to go down to Zante on a Friday afternoon and see all sorts of young people down there lying who couldn't go down there before. Some from Newtown, some from McKnight, and people from McKnight telling you they can't pass the ferry terminal because afraid somebody attacked them. That is how we were living in this country. And he seems to forget that. Persons from Sandy Point telling you they can't go to St. Paul's. And persons from St. Paul's likewise telling you they ain't going to Sandy Point. They want to go back, say they take a bus, go the other way. Because of the gang violence that was taking place in this country. You can't place a value on a life, Mr. Speaker. And we have been able to curtail the number of homicides in this country. And he should give this government credit for that. He said he went and he spoke to one of the universities about the decrease in crime. And the fact is that he failed to deliver such. I asked him to go to the same university now and I asked the university if the students feel safer in this country. I'm sure that the answer would be a resounding yes. We have restored peace to this country. Yes. He said we spent $12 million, allocated $12 million for this year. We project to spend $10 million next year. Well, at least you're seeing a decrease, not only in the number of homicides, but you're seeing a decrease in the amount of money being spent in respect of the peace initiative. It therefore means that we are yielding results from it. Yeah? He glad for the peace. But he's still a criticizer. Confused. Glad for it. But still criticizing. Mr. Speaker, again I repeat that if he wants to know how the money was spent, call a meeting of the Public Accounts Committee. Yes, that's what he's about. You are the chairperson of the Public Accounts Committee. Show the people that you're serious. You ain't just coming in here and grandstanding. But you're attempting to find answers on their behalf. Call the meeting. What is he waiting on? When he became leader of the opposition, he said, we ain't appoint the Public Accounts Committee. You appoint the Public Accounts Committee that he is in charge of. He still hasn't called a meeting after some 60 years as the chairperson for the Public Accounts Committee. He had 2015 to call a meeting, not one. 2016, 17, 18, 19, 20, almost finished. And not a single meeting of the Public Accounts Committee. The member for number 1 would have done a better job, and that is why you need to take over the Labour Party. I don't understand how you have a man leading. You call yourself Next Gen. And a man who don't pass the next generation. Again, pension. Don't pass more than 2 gen. I don't know what kind of gen that gen you know what about you. And guy leading, you don't call yourself next gen. Somebody explain that to me. You think Gene, I could have sung with Gene and Gene come tell me in a party with him in the next gen and Gene lead the party? I've been practical and honest, Gene about 20 years older than I am. Why wouldn't I be partying with you, Gene? That is the point.
So he's talking to Jackie?
Yes. And they're the convention up to Sunday. And none of them step up. But warning you, you know, I'm warning you.
Yes.
That he came in here with some people 2015 to 2020.
Yes.
Look around, tell me if you see them even in the gallery. I even wonder if you and them follow because none of them come listen to him today. Not one.
That's the next thing again, for sure.
Not one showed up to give him support. I wonder why it is happening Sunday.
And the last time they had a chance to be leader of the opposition, they take it.
They refuse it. Member for number one award to the wise is enough.
I see it not for sale. Best thing happened for you and all.
For me, mine not for sale either.
I think you want to come over here.
You want to come over here? We have space, you know. We could provide a next desk over here for you. Think about it, because I don't understand. Next gen and a man who collect pension, leading the next generation. Something wrong with that? Huh? And Mr. Speaker, that is the history of how he has managed this country. And budget after budget comes in, criticizes everything. Peace initiative, he has a problem with that. The government said it's going to borrow some money. He has a problem with that. Well, who borrowed more money than Douglas in this country? We said we're going to borrow $50 million. And that's easy. Easy, you know. $50 million easy. Douglas said, why you need to borrow money? Douglas met this country with an economy that was the best within Latin America and the Caribbean. Bankrupt the country. Put the country in debt of over $1 billion. Now chastising this government about borrowing a measly $50 million. He can't be serious. During COVID, worst pandemic in the world. Every place you go, Mr. Speaker, you have economic shocks. Countries can't afford to pay salaries. We responded. Healthcare, more money. Students coming home from Jamaica, we assisted them. Not a single cent they had to pay. Other countries, they had to pay, I think, about half. And in some cases, they paid all. More persons on the PAP program. He criticized Social Security for giving monies to persons. And in almost every single way we have responded. A water bill, you don't have to pay it now. Electricity bill, you don't have to pay it now. Unincorporated business tax, and he lambasted the small business sector. The very same small business sector that is benefiting from the reduction in unincorporated business tax. He said, we are not doing anything for them. Well, if you reduce the tax, Mr. Speaker, that amounts to nothing. If you are paying less, Mr. Speaker, and the fact is that if you ain't doing any business, then of course you aren't paying anything. But if you're doing business, we say, okay, we're going to give you a reduction in the tax. Agricultural sector, we provided support to the agricultural sector. $10 million. Put money in development bank for small businesses. I don't, what else it is he wants from this government?
This budget, $5 million in there for small business.
And next $5 million in this budget for small businesses. But I don't think he has read the budget.
No.
He hasn't read it. And so he doesn't really know what is in there. So he comes, and as I said, somebody gave him something and told him to read that. And he comes in and he reads it. He told me one year, when I was in opposition, and I challenged him on the budget. He said, I don't write any budget. I don't write any budget. It's the people in finance that write it, and I come and read it. And so he continues. You remember that? He continues to do the very same thing. So somebody write it, gave it to him, and he comes in and he reads it. Mr. Speaker, how much time I have left?
You just finished 1 hour.
Just finished 1 hour. So I have a next half an hour. I have a minute to speak about you. And so that is what you have gotten from him, Mr. Speaker. Nothing of substance to add to the budget, Mr. Speaker.
So you were thinking about supporting him to pay no, the transfers is the best budget.
Mr. Speaker, some of the reports that I've referenced, the reports actually give, not only, well, before I get to that, some of those reports, Mr. Speaker, commend the leaders within the Caribbean for the stance that they have taken relative to COVID-19, Mr. Speaker. And if I could quickly, Mr. Speaker, refer to two of those particular reports. This one, Mr. Speaker, and I would have referenced it before, the one from Global Americans. It says here, the Caribbean's COVID-19 response. Caribbean leaders took a strong leadership role in dealing with the pandemic, prompted by a perception that the international multilateral system was faltering. Strong global leadership was absent, and key allies like the United States and United Kingdom were struggling to deal with their own problems. Several Caribbean leaders viewed them as examples of how not to tackle the pandemic. The decision to withdraw the U.S. from the World Health Organization by the administration of President Donald Trump only reinforced the perception. Somebody who's writing this article, Mr. Speaker, would have said, in similar words, that the member for number 6 is not a good example of how not to do anything with your finances. Because he's not a good example, Mr. Speaker. And so here is an article commending the Caribbean leaders for taking strong leadership at a time when it was needed. And in that respect, we must commend our own Prime Minister, who has played a key role as the chairperson for health at the CARICOM level in terms of tackling the pandemic, not only here in St. Kitts and Nevis, but providing leadership in the region, Mr. Speaker. And it says, consequently, most Caribbean countries move quickly to unilaterally close their borders, introduce quarantine measures, impose social distancing protocols, and worked harder to coordinate regional policies, especially in the procurement of personal protective equipment. The last was made harder for individual countries due to a traditional reliance on the United States in a time of crisis and the Trump administration's decision to block distribution from selling PPE overseas due to shortages at home. While Brazil, Mexico, and Peru have struggled to contain a rise in infections and deaths, the Caribbean has done considerably better. Commending the Caribbean for what we have been able to do. And Mr. Speaker, there's a next report which also commends the Caribbean for taking the type of leadership action that it did. And if I recall correctly, that particular report is one from the OECS. So, Mr. Speaker, in more than one instance, Caribbean leaders have been commended for taking strong action. It says here, at the problem avoidance level, the governments of the OECS acted quickly and decisively. Close monitoring of the spread on the global level, measures for early detection, early isolation, and early treatment, with an escalating compendium of restrictions and precautions as the dynamic unfolded. Although not described in the public domain, the governments of the Caribbean and the OECS in particular took bold and firm stances against the insistence of powerful economic actors in cruise tourism, for example, that sought to maintain business as usual in the face of threats unusual. The results of this speak for themselves. As the cutoff date of this report, the infection curve in the OECS was comparatively flat compared to international trends. There has been relative containment of imported cases, except for Martinique and Guadeloupe, which, as part of France, experienced a great volume of unrestricted travel between themselves and an open borders, Europe. The vast majority of COVID-19 related deaths in the OECS have occurred in these two member states. Again, Caribbean governments looking out for their people. That is exactly what we have done in the Federation of St. Kitts and Nevis, Mr. Speaker. I remember at almost every day the cabinet was meeting to discuss COVID-19 and to take the necessary actions to ensure that our people are protected. We closed the borders, and we were heavily criticizing some quarters for closing the borders. And if you look at some of these very same reports, Mr. Speaker, they speak to the fact that closing your borders, doing lockdowns, that those are actually the best thing that you can do to deal with COVID-19. They make reference to the fact that yes, you can open up, and open up only increases mobility. But in terms of economic recovery, it actually might slow down economic recovery because you are increasing the chances of persons contacting COVID-19. The report speaks to the fact that when you look at the labor market within the Caribbean region, it is vastly different to many other economies because of the types of work that persons are involved in doing. Whether it is you want to look at the tourism sector, and so in terms of social distancing, it is difficult to do such. They reference that persons depending on public transportation, a large number of persons. And so again, you have challenges in terms of that. They look at various areas of employment, Mr. Speaker. And the report said to us that what we have been doing, we have done the right thing. We are different, yes. We are small. We are challenged. But we have risen to the occasion. I said earlier, Mr. Speaker, that one particular report that I read, and it has a number of policy prescriptions, and one of the policy prescriptions in that particular report is to increase taxes on those who could most afford it. This budget, Mr. Speaker, isn't doing any such thing. No such thing is being proposed. We are saying to persons that yes, government revenues challenge, but let us all bear the brunt of it together. No increase in taxes. And I can't find the exact page, Mr. Speaker. But it says here, for example, further tempering the expectations of a quick economic rebound, The analysis document that easing lockdowns tends to have a positive effect on mobility, but the impact is weaker than that of tightening lockdowns. These findings suggest that economies will continue to operate below potential while health risks persist even if lockdowns are lifted. Therefore, policymakers should be wary of removing policy support too quickly and consider ways to protect the most vulnerable and support economic activity consistent with social distances. These may include measures to reduce contact, indemnity, and make the workplace safer. For example, by promoting contactless payments, facilitating a gradual reallocation of resources toward less contact-intensive sectors, and enhancing work from home. For example, by improving internet connectivity and supporting investment in information technology. I have no doubt that the Minister with responsibility for information technology will speak to how we intend to achieve some of that, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I can't find the specific paragraph that I was referencing in terms of the recommendation that certain persons should be taxed more. But that hasn't been our response. And like the member for number 6, we haven't come in here and say, we're adding on a fuel surcharge. We haven't come in here and say we're going to reintroduce VAT and food and medicine. We haven't come in here and say in terms of corporate income tax that we are going to increase it. We haven't come and said that those who make in a certain level of salary, that they will pay more to government. We haven't come in here and start to introduce personal income tax because we are confident, Mr. Speaker, that we will get past COVID-19 and that the economy of St. Kitts and Nevis will rebound and rebound strongly. That is what we are seeking to do, Mr. Speaker. And so in the interim, we have said that rather than doing those things, we will continue to provide support to a number of different persons who have been negatively affected by COVID-19. You can't, Mr. Speaker, expect persons to pay more at a time when the revenue base has decreased substantially. That isn't realistic, Mr. Speaker, because you're already in a recession. So we don't intend to push the country further on the brink of such. We have continued with our capital projects, and some of those I will speak to in a few minutes as I speak to the Ministry, Mr. Speaker, of Public Infrastructure, Water Services, and Urban Development. This government, Mr. Speaker, in my view, has responded well to the effects of COVID-19. And anybody out there, Mr. Speaker, who is objective would have to agree to such, Mr. Speaker, because the reality of the facts are there to give support to this claim, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I now turn to the ministries that I have responsibility for. Mr. Speaker, very early, we said that in regards to the capital projects of the government, that the intention, Mr. Speaker, is to continue to implement and to build out those particular capital projects. We didn't just say it, Mr. Speaker, but the evidence of this is there for everyone to see, Mr. Speaker. And so what are some of these capital projects, Mr. Speaker? The ministry undertook 31 capital projects for 2020, Mr. Speaker. Some of the projects, the Island Main Road, Mr. Speaker. And you would note, Mr. Speaker, that that particular project is still ongoing. It came to an halt temporarily because of the lockdown. and because of the curfews that we had in place, Mr. Speaker. But shortly thereafter, the project has continued as expected. Friday of last week, Mr. Speaker, the company engaged to repave the Island Main Road. So repaving would have taken a vacation for the Christmas and the Carnival season, and then in January, we expect that the company will return and the work will resume. We still have an area between Sandy Point and New Guinea to pave. Sandy Point hasn't been done as yet, Mr. Speaker, because there is a need to ensure that the water lines, the main water lines in Sandy Point, are replaced. If you drive to Sandy Point, you would recognize that the water department is there doing work in terms of changing some of the smaller lines on the seaside of the road. The reason for doing that, some smaller pipes are being put in, is so that the likelihood of having to dig up from one side of the road to the next will be decreased. We have seen that from time to time, because you have a line being damaged or you have a new connection that you need to make, you have the road being dug up from time to time. And so we're trying, Mr. Speaker, to change that as much as possible. The main lines in Sandy Point are expected to be changed in January. And so Sandy Point probably will be the last area where you will see the Island Main Road being resurfaced. When the company returns, you still have the area between Stonefort down to Godwin Gut to be resurfaced. In the interim, we note that you have sidewalks being put in, areas, you have had strengthening of bridges, you have had the road being broadened, and you have some corners being taken out so that there is a much better driving experience for all users of our road network, in particular the Island Main Road. Some of the other projects, Mr. Speaker, that we have would be the Old Road Fishery City Fence project. That is still ongoing, Mr. Speaker. Of course, the major one in Old Road is that of the new road across Old Road Bay. That also is substantially completed, Mr. Speaker, and the work there continues. We expect that sometime during the course of early next year, certainly before the first half, that particular road would be completed. What a number of persons don't know is that the Public Infrastructure Ministry also supervises a number of other contracts on behalf of other ministries within government. And so you have, for example, the upgrade of the Interior High Court. That was undertaken by the Public Infrastructure Ministry. The construction of the Atlas Lodge Community Center, that is near completion. The cost attached to that is some $3.2 million. That project supervised by Public Works. The Murphy Explorer Club building, that is basically completed at a cost of $2.4 million. The Magistrate and Mediation Center, completed at a cost of $2.7 million. The Sandy Point Police Station, near to completion, and that comes at a cost of $6.0 million. We have had to provide front desks and dividers with glass to many government offices as a result of the COVID-19 protocols. Even as you look at Parliament where we are, Mr. Speaker, the Public Works would have been engaged in terms of ensuring that we're here and we're able to have the necessary social distancing. And that was done over the course of a weekend by the efficient staff at the Public Works Department, and I think we must commend them, Mr. Speaker, for the job that they are doing. The installation of traffic lights, Mr. Speaker, we have had the first phase, and we are about to enter the second phase for the installation of traffic lights. I nor that the persons out of Jamaica who are assisting us with that project, they are on island. One individual is actually already out of quarantine, and as soon as the others are out of quarantine, we are going to see traffic lights being installed at a number of other junctions in the Federation. And there are 7 additional areas which have been identified for the second phase. This would be by the Hosford gas station, the junction of Dickerson Street and Wellington Road, the junction of College Street and Keyan Street, the intersection of Keyan Street and College Street Gut, College Street and the Bay Road by Social Security, the Bay Road and Port Zante roundabout, west, that is besides Ram Supermarket, the junction of the Bay Road and Sandown Road, and the intersection of the Bay Road, Boardwalk Road, and Rams Cash and Carry exit. We're expecting, based on the timeline which has been provided, that those new traffic lights should be up and running by the end of January, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, on the issue of water, that has been a vexing issue and of concern, reasonably so, to quite a number of persons, especially persons in the Keyan area who have suffered without water for many, many, many years, Mr. Speaker. The member for number 7 has outlined on several occasions that even as a student at Keyan High, this problem has persisted. I am happy to report this afternoon, Mr. Speaker, that just this week we are in the process of signing a contract with BEAD, a company, to do exploration of water in the Keyan community. It is anticipated that the crew from BEAD will be on island as of the 1st of February. We also have a well, Mr. Speaker, named Shadwell 2, which we have experienced some issues with in terms of the quality of the water. The contract which is being signed with BEAD this week also speaks to doing some remediation work relative to the well at Shadwell 2, so that the water quality becomes such that persons are able to consume it. Those 2 issues, though, Mr. Speaker, are not the only issues affecting the Water Services Department. On many occasions, the crew has been called out to repair a number of water lines which have been in place for years. And so the intention, Mr. Speaker, during 2021 is to do a mapping exercise, identify all of the lines, determine the age of those lines, and begin a program in terms of changing those lines, Mr. Speaker. Additionally, we also recognize that there are some other communities that we have issues with water. And so after we would have dealt with the situation in Keyan and Shadwell too, our intention is to take a critical look at some of those communities. We are looking at some alternatives in terms of addressing those issues. We have before us, for example, a proposal from the UAE for a desalination plant. We have already went out to tender in terms of the EIA for that project. And that project is supposed to be partly powered by solar. So it is different, it is something new to the Federation. But it's a project that we are actively pursuing, and we expect within coming weeks and months, we will be able to tell the public more in terms of where we're going with that project. We have a next proposal from a company out of Trinidad looking at desalination. That too is being reviewed, and we will determine where we go with that particular project. So, in terms of addressing the issues of water, Mr. Speaker, we are very well on the way in terms of that. And so if you check the estimates for this year, you would recognize that some $2 million have been allocated to the ministry to enable us to be able to undertake the necessary upgrades in water. Within the ministry, Mr. Speaker, we have an energy unit. And interestingly, it was only in the month of October that we celebrated Energy Month. We are looking at a number of alternative energy projects, Mr. Speaker. Just last week, Thursday, we had the groundbreaking ceremony for the solar farm. That solar farm is expected to be the biggest within the Caribbean region. It should generate some 35 megawatts of power, supplying approximately 16 to 18 to the electricity plant, and it also comes with a battery storage so that the excess power will be stored in those batteries.
Honourable Member, your initial 1.5 hours period of time has expired.
Mr. Speaker, in that respect, I am asking the House to grant me an additional 30 minutes to bring my presentation to a close.
The question is that the Honourable Member has requested an additional 30 minutes. Those in favour? Aye. Those against? The ayes have it.
So, Mr. Speaker, in 2021, we expect to see that project being built out and the supply of electricity to Skellig from the solar plant. We also have before us a wind farm project that we are contemplating. We are in negotiations on that particular project. Due to COVID, it has slowed down that aspect of it, but we're hoping that in 2021, that hopefully that project can come on stream. We also have a waste-to-energy project that we are considering. We have the desalination project that I spoke to and said that there's a component of it that involves solar. The LED lighting project, Mr. Speaker, I think that is a project which encompasses both St. Kitts and Nevis. And so hopefully Nevis here would have recognized that the street lights over there are being changed to LED, which is supposed to be able to save power. They're supposed to last longer. As you look around St. Kitts, persons would recognize that the street lights are being changed. Part of the project also involves changing the lighting on a number of sporting facilities in both St. Kitts and Nevis. So that is being pursued. The electric school bus project is being coordinated by the Ministry of the Environment, and hopefully the Minister will speak to it. But it is still a project that is being pursued. The feed-in tariff project, and the feed-in tariff project, Mr. Speaker, is one in which, whether it is you have the solar on your house, you are generating excess power, and you want to sell back that power to Skellig, you want to feed it back into the grid, the feed-in tariff will allow Skellig to be able to pay you for that excess power that you're feeding into the grid. Admittedly, we don't have the expertise to do it in terms of developing the necessary regulations, etc. We have reached out to CARICOM for assistance, and CARICOM has already indicated a willingness to provide us with someone to assist us with implementation of the feed-in tariff. We have been able, Mr. Speaker, to train a number of persons in the installation of solar panels. Some of those persons have gone on to become certified, and of course, as we move more and more into that sector of energy generation, renewable energy, we want to be able to train more and more persons to be able to work in that particular sector. The Post Office, Mr. Speaker, has recognized its own fair share of challenges as a result of COVID-19. In particular, flights were grounded, and so that dependence on flights to bring in mail presented a challenge. The flights are now slowly returning, and so with that return, we're expecting to see an increase in the volume of service being offered by the Post Office. You take BA, for example, which hasn't been doing the weekly flights from out of the UK, and you would recognize some of the challenges there. Of course, they have the option to ship by ocean, but we know the length of time that takes, Mr. Speaker. And whether or not we want to believe it, there's still a number of persons who depend on the mail for a number of essential services. Pensioners within the US, for example, who live here, some of them receive their pension checks by way of the mail every single month. They may have had to wait in the interim a little longer to receive some of those checks, but we are hoping that with the return of the flights, with the opening of the airport in particular, that problem will no longer exist to the extent that it does now. We have renovated the post office, the main post office on the Bay Road, at a cost of close to $300,000. Those repairs are coming to a completion. We have done some work on a number of the other substations throughout the island, Sandy Point, Cayon, Tabernacle, etc. One of the projects that we are looking at in terms of the mail service is to provide cluster boxes at a number of communities. As we begin to build houses in more and more remote areas, as NHC begins to build homes in clusters, we have recognized the need to ensure that you have those cluster boxes, so that rather than the postman having to go to each house, and sometimes when the postman goes to a house, you're confronted by dogs, and so you can't enter the yard. With COVID-19, social distancing and all this sort of thing, the post office is looking at that particular project, so that rather than having to walk from house to house, at least you just go to the cluster boxes and you're able to put in the mails for persons. We have a situation, you go by each of the post office and you recognize that you have persons asking the post mistress to hold mail for them, and in some instances they don't collect the mails until weeks upon weeks after. I'm saying to the public now that that practice will discontinue. As a matter of fact, at most of the post offices, the substations, you have post boxes. But persons don't want to rent the post boxes, but expect the people at the post office, the staff, to hold the mails for you. Well, that is the purpose of having the post boxes. Rent the post box and you collect your mail whenever it is. So you avoid paying for the mailbox and say, well, hold the mail for me until whenever I come to collect it. That practice, as I said, Mr. Speaker, we're bringing it to an end. It is either you make provisions to get a mailbox, or your mail will somehow be delivered to your home. Urban development, Mr. Speaker, unfortunately still continues to be staffed by one individual, but nevertheless, that particular section of the ministry has been collaborating with a number of other ministries within the government service to ensure that a number of projects are implemented. Street vending still remains a problem, and so that is one of the projects being worked on by urban development. We have been working with the Department of Environment in the design of the Royal St. Kitts National Park in the Bastia Valley, and plans for that are expected to be finalized in the second quarter of 2021. We are looking at urban renewal not only in the Bastia area, in particular McKnight, Irish Town, Newtown, and also at certain areas in Sandy Point. The gentleman there has also been working with the Ministry of Tourism in respect of the West Bus Terminal, in particular, making it look much better than it currently looks, and that is more or less the bars that you have down there. And that is a matter which recently came up in Cabinet, and perhaps the Minister of Tourism, who has responsibility for that, will speak some more to that particular project. We also want to look at an address system as it is. Shawn Richards, Crabbill, Sandy Point, no house number, no nothing. And while I might be easy to find, when you begin to look at some of the other developments, and you got to look for an individual, you have no clue as to which lot number it is, the name of the street, etc. And so that is a project being looked at by urban development. Independence Square rehabilitation, and I'm sure my friend Jean Howell would be happy to hear this, because it's a project that we're looking at comprehensively. We have been receiving a number of complaints within recent times in terms of the lighting inside of the square. We have already engaged someone to look at the lighting there, and so hopefully in 2021 persons would see a marked improvement in Independence Square and feel much safer and comfortable in utilizing the Independence Square. Mr. Speaker, in regards to capital projects earmarked for 2021, I would have spoken about some of those for Water Services Department. In terms of the Public Works Division, we have the road reinvestment, well, not the road, but the coastal area reinvestment program that we're looking at in the area there just outside of Brimstone Hill, the New Guinea area. We have had persons who live in the Portland area who have called the ministry with concerns relative to that area, and so we're looking at a project for some $4 million, which would see some rock armoring taking place from Portlands all the way around to the Irish Town Bay Road area. That is a critical project. We have to continue to protect our coastline, Mr. Speaker. And so you would recognize, Mr. Speaker, as I said, the capital projects that are currently in place not only continue, but we have a number of new capital projects coming on stream for 2021. We have been provided with money to do some of the roads in some of the communities that are still without roads. So some of those would also be rolled out in 2021. I know a number of communities out there are in need of roads. I hear the complaints every day. Jean, I have been to constituency number 8. Look, I didn't promise you any. I said I've been to constituency number 8 to look at the roads. Minister from number 3 also has a long list. In my own constituency, I have a long list. I can't get my piece from my mother. When she tell me, so she said that her road needs paving, she sends the message with other persons that her road is in need of paving up in the Crabbill area. I get it every day. They tell me I must drive up there, use a car, drive up there, don't come in a Jeep, because they want me to experience what they have been experiencing. You go up in the Farms Meadows area, same thing. Upper Romney's ground, same thing. And a number of other areas within the constituency. And so I want to say to the persons, not only my constituency, but throughout the rest of the Federation, is that in no single year we will be able to pave all of the roads. However, the commitment is there, year after year, to pave roads in the different communities. A particular amount might be budgeted. But if the financial fortunes of the government are good enough, we're able to go to Cabinet from time to time and say to the Cabinet, look, we need extra money to pave some additional roads. And sometimes if the Minister of Finance is in a good mood, he readily agrees with us. Sometimes it may take a little coaxing for him to agree. Maybe you got to promise him one in his constituency, I don't know. But 5 of them? I don't mind giving you 5 if you don't give me 5 too. But that is how the process works. So even though a particular amount may be budgeted, it doesn't mean that we may not be able to actually do more. Even sometimes as you look at a particular area, you recognize that there are other circumstances which might necessitate having to pave the road at that particular point in time. And so you just have to make the necessary financial allocations to be able to do so. If you take, for example, where you had the landslide recently in the Frigate Bay area, you had good roads there. But it means that the government will now have to do some repairs there because the road over there was damaged as a result of the landslide. And, Mr. Speaker, that in itself points out the workings of government. Because you sit down and you try to project things and estimate for things as best as you can. But you never know what will happen. And COVID-19 also is a very good example of that. I don't think any of us imagined that we would have had a pandemic of this nature this year. I never imagined in my lifetime, Mr. Speaker, that I would be home sitting down in a house, can't come out of the house. No planes coming in, no cruise ships coming in, businesses closed. You have to line up to go inside the supermarket, and I've always had a policy, if I got to line up to spend my money, I ain't lining up. But it has now become the reality for many of us. And we have to try as best as possible to live within that norm as best as we can. It is against that backdrop, Mr. Speaker, that we have presented the budget estimates in respect of 2021. A budget, Mr. Speaker, which in my view is forward-looking and forward-thinking. A budget that isn't asking the citizens of this country to pay more at a time when revenue for government itself has decreased. And I think persons out there have been reasonable. Instead, we have provided relief to persons because the government money, it is the people's money. And so at a time when the people need the government to be compassionate, the government has been compassionate upon the people. There are some unemployed who are trying to find jobs within government. And as you explain to those persons, that government isn't hiring because government itself has seen a reduction in revenue due to COVID-19. Additionally, government gave a commitment to those on step to bring them on full-time. Persons understand that. It doesn't mean that at some point in time that things are not going to change. We also understand that because a number of businesses are still closed, that more and more persons will look towards the government for employment. But the government is trying as best as possible to provide the necessary stimulus within the economy so that more and more businesses will reopen. We could have taken a decision, for example, to have the borders closed for longer. But we also recognize that there's an economic effect to doing that in terms of more and more persons remaining unemployed. And so we're trying to balance things, Mr. Speaker. We have been careful about it. We ask our people to continue to be careful. Thus far, we haven't had any community spread. And that is what we hope will continue, that we don't get the community spread. We can only do that if we take the necessary actions to protect ourselves. All of us, Mr. Speaker, must be engaged in doing so. It is not the government alone which has a responsibility. We all have a responsibility to do so. And so in closing, I want to say to the good people of constituency number 5, thanks for your support. I would have mentioned that the police station is opening soon. I recognize the fact that we have some roads to do, and there are a number of other projects that we intend to pursue within the Sandy Point community. We are all about developing this nation in the best interest of all of the people of both St. Kitts and Nevis. May it so please you, Mr. Speaker.